of the music industry over the year. What do you put down as your occupation when you're asked these days?
Musician still works.
Musician still does it.
I've never stopped making music, so I figure regardless of what else I pick up, that'll always be somewhere on the resume. So I figure it's easier than having to explain something else. At least I have a track record as a musician.
Pretty well covers everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you remember a particular point or time, just going back to your younger years, when you realised it really hit you without a doubt that you were headed for a career in music?
I didn't know I would have a career in music until I already had it. I didn't plan on it, but when I graduated from high school, I knew I wasn't going back to. I wasn't going into the higher education system, and the other alternative was, of course, to go to Vietnam, and I wasn't too keen on that. So I got into a band right away, and lo and behold, I was making a living and never really had to get a real job.
Right. Just talk about your band, the Naz.
Yeah.
When you formed that band, did you have a blueprint or a particular sound in mind that you wanted, or pre-planned there?
Pretty much. I started out in a white blues band, and that was fine as long as it lasted. But that started to break down quickly as the various members went back to playing white music. In particular, the San Francisco acid rock scene was starting to happen. So the band suddenly decided that instead of being Paul Butterfield, they'd rather be the Grateful Dead, almost overnight. So my influences were more British, I guess, and even the bands that some of the bands that we emulated when we thought we were a blues band were white British bands like the Yardbirds and to a certain degree the Rolling Stones. So I decided that when I put the Naz together, it was my first opportunity to actually build a band from scratch, that we would emulate certain British influences, in particular like the Who and the Yardbirds, but also have a vocal element that was more like the Beatles and in some cases like the Beach Boys. So it was an unusual combination at the time because singing was sort of not that important. It was becoming less important all the time, and it was more important what kind of style you adopted, and so the Naz in that sense were a unique formula.
Okay, before we cover too much history here, something I'd really like to talk about, and I'm sure you would too, is your subscription service that you've got running on the internet at the moment.
Whoa, that was a big leap.
It was, wasn't it?
From the distant past to the future in one bound. Well, yeah, I've been in the record industry for 30 years and watched it evolve, and here in the late 90s, I've gone through most of the significant phases. Of course, I was pretty young when Elvis Presley first had his first hit record, but I suppose Elvis redefined what popular music was in terms of its global impact. Frank Sinatra became popular during the age of radio, and I think Elvis Presley was the first one to really be more successful at records than he was in the previous medium. And since then, it's evolved through evolutions from the single format to the album format, from the album format to the tape format, from the tape format to the CD format. And through all that time, it's just become more and more of a ordeal in a certain sense to get a record together and get it out. The expectations are greater, the process is more protracted and expensive, and at this particular point, it's not serving a lot of the artists who are in the business, in that the outlets to experience music haven't expanded as fast as the amount of music has expanded. So we have a new medium now called the web, and this medium, it has the potential, albeit a very seminal one at this point, of overtaking the previous medium of CDs and records in terms of distribution of music, and also the ability to expose music. In other words, it becomes not only a medium to deliver music, it becomes a medium to experience new music that you used to experience by listening to the radio. You have the option of going out and browsing for new music, or going out and searching based on some criteria other than like knowing the name of the artist. The ultimate application of this, I believe, is taking that core audience that usually sits at the back end of the process. In other words, they get the record after the record company has already commissioned and paid for it, and you've already produced it some 6 to 9 months previous to it hitting the market, and then you make your return essentially at the back end of a large investment of time and expense. The web makes it possible for you to get connected directly to your audience. Therefore, that audience can underwrite up front the cost of making the records, since they're the ones who you're depending on anyway at the back end of the process. Move them up to the front of the process. Also utilize the technology to give them the ability to experience more of what the artist does, and to experience what they do as it's being done. And you increase the value of the relationship between the core audience and the artist. You reduce the costs of distributing to them, because you're not into a speculative inventory-based, how many discs do we make mode. You know exactly how many discs to make. And ultimately, the purpose is to allow a greater number of artists to survive on relatively smaller audiences that they connect to directly through the web.
Have you had any feedback from conventional record companies as to their thoughts on the concept?
There are more conventional record labels getting into this, and any label that hasn't made the commitment so far is talking about it in the boardroom, certainly. But there are labels such as N2K who, even though they are modeled after the old-style record label, have declared their intention to do most of their promotion at least over the web, if not direct delivery. Most record companies and the RIAA, which is the association of all the labels, are now developing policies about electronic direct distribution to people in their homes, and addressing the issues involved there, such as illegal duplication and other protections of copyright, and also the feasibility of it. We still can't deliver really high-quality audio without some expense to the end user. In other words, they have to have a certain amount of local storage and a modem of a certain speed, and of course they have to have a connection to the web in order to participate in this. So trying to get all of these elements together in a way that makes a business profitable is still a challenge, because people are just starting to become aware of the possibilities.
So down the track then, could you foresee a day when this could be the major way of getting music out to the public?
I foresee it, and now many other people are foreseeing it. For instance, the new web TV box. I don't know if they sell it in Australia yet, but they make a box that connects to your television. It looks like a cable box and allows you to surf the web using your television.
Ah, yes. Yep.
And the new version of the box has a 1.5 gig drive built in. Obviously, you're intended to download some large things onto that drive, or else you wouldn't need 1.5 gig. It's bigger than most people have in their personal computers. So it's already starting, the technology necessary is already starting to find its way into people's homes. In Japan, for instance, they have an excess of ISDN capacity, so it's just as cheap to get an ISDN line as it is to get a regular phone line. And soon, and probably sooner than later, if you're not paying attention, there's going to be a considerable market of people interested in making good on their investment in connectivity and storage and peripheral devices and things like that. And so people have to start thinking in terms of this electronic direct delivery, because anyone who's bought the necessary elements to take advantage of it is going to start to create a demand.
Well, as far as your side is concerned, is there, what, in terms of material, what are we looking at here? Reworkings of old works as well as new material?
I am fortunate enough to have access to all my original master tapes, so I can do anything I want with almost any part of my repertoire. Although it will, in all likelihood, depend more on new music than it will on old music. I can do interesting things with previously recorded music, but I can't fully exploit it because I don't own it 100%.
Yeah.
So I can do occasional thing with it, with some of my old stuff, to increase the value of the subscription that I'm offering to my core audience. But as far as making it to any degree the substance of the offering, I'm not really inclined or free to do that.
Right.
I am inclined over the long run to eventually take everything that I've recorded and put it into a form that makes it electronically accessible to people. And that's a different project. So.
In terms of numbers, you've been running a few months now. What sort of subscriber base have you got now?
Well, of course, we have a big bubble right at the front. I don't know the exact numbers, but when I first announced that a lot of people were interested and came on, immediately as that happened, I discovered, technological problems and limitations that caused me to sort of back off right away and take care of those infrastructural elements, which we're just kind of getting over with now. Some of the solutions turn out to be radical. In other words, people are having so much trouble getting the right browser and all of the necessary plugins and stuff to experience what I wanted to deliver, that in the end it turned out to be easier to design and build my own browser and deliver that. And that would connect directly to my web-related resources, my live resources, and take a lot less room than the other browsers, which are big and clunky and designed for not necessarily information and entertainment consumers, but often more designed to satisfy business needs, and therefore the sky's the limit. Some of the other solutions are server performance. In other words, if people are going to be downloading great big files all the time, songs, even though they can be compressed down to a fraction of what they originally were, that fraction, if you're going to retain any degree of quality, is not going to be any better than 10 or 12 to 1. So in an average song, like a 4-minute song, that's still about a 4 megabyte file to download. And for most people, that's at least considered an investment of time. And they're not going to do it that often.
Yeah.
At least not initially. If they do it a few times and are highly satisfied with the end result, yeah, they'll do it more. But the more people do it, the more demand it puts on the system, and then it starts to work worse again.
Yeah.
So these are the growing pains of trying to build a new commerce model, and even a new idea of what the product actually is. Right. I'm no longer selling discs per se. I'm selling a relationship to me.
Cool.
And that relationship can be satisfied in a number of ways, aside from simply delivering chunks of music. For instance, on my site I have a bulletin board system and chat and email and various other services that you might get if you, for instance, signed up to America Online or Australia Online, if they've got such a thing.
Yep.
And that kind of increases the value of the service in lieu of people always having something to hold in their hands. So a lot of this whole exercise is discovering what works for this medium and getting that implemented and working as well as it possibly can.
Sure. So basically what it all boils down to is a much more personal relationship between artist and audience.
Yeah, well, normally, as I said, the audience is at the very end of the process.
Yeah.
If I had a conventional record deal, record company would advance me an amount of money that was based on a guess of how many people were sure to buy the record. That would be essentially my advance. Then once I was done the record, once I started the record, nowadays, since records are pretty much the driving element in the process, I would invest some amount of time in writing and recording the material, probably anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks. Some people invest a lot more time in that. Once the record company gets it, they evaluate it and slot it into their release schedule, which is normally no less than 4 to 6 months after you've delivered it. And then by the time people find out about it and actually get the record, from the time you started recording the first song till the time they listen to it, may be as much as a year, maybe even more. So the music has lost a certain vitality for the producer of the music.
Sure.
Because it's a year down the line by the time anyone's gotten to hear it. Then the musician has gotten into a phase of promotion rather than production. In other words, if the record enjoys any degree of success at all, or if you wanted to enjoy some degree of success, then you go out for the next year and play that material over and over and over again. So you're not really living a musician's life.
No.
For about 3 months out of the year, out of every year and a half or 2 years, at least according to a nominal release schedule, you're writing new music and creating and recording new music, and then the rest of that year and a half, 2 year period, you are promoting music.
Right.
The idea of electronic delivery means that you spend more time actually being a musician and producing music, because you know that there's an ear at the other end of that wire. And anytime you make a piece of music, someone is ready to hear it. And it completely changes the way you live and create as a musician. It's more like before there were records, or before there were albums at least. Well, when the record market was driven by singles, you would do a song and put it out. If it didn't catch fire, in 6 weeks or something like that, well, boom, you just go back in the studio and record another one.
That's right.
So that you're not going such long stretches between actually getting in and making some new music. And the fact that here at the other end of that evolution, the CD is so expensive to produce and so expensive to promote that everyone makes a much larger investment, and therefore the potential for failure is much larger than it was when you're just making a couple promotional singles and sending them out to radio stations.
You to settle this up too beforehand, you went through the process of severing all your contractual ties to record labels and publishers and the like.
Yeah.
Just how big a task was that for you, and what was the greatest hurdle you found in going through that?
Well, the task really essentially is just to wait them out. I didn't. I think on my Warner Brothers record contract, which was the last long-term global deal that I had, we waived a final album option, which was by mutual consent and allowed me to get off that much earlier. But then I still didn't have my electronic distribution ideas or my interactive artist ideas fully evolved to the point that I could go completely without some guaranteed market. So I had a Japanese label deal for another 3 albums that went for like 4 years after that, 4 or 5 years. I got out of that just earlier this year, so I have no long-term obligations to any label. When you've spent your entire career more or less living off of regular infusions of capital from the record label, the most difficult thing is biting the bullet and not taking that money for however long it takes to get out of all your previous obligations. So that's been the hardest part. I essentially cut off a large source of income.
Yeah.
And had to kind of go in the hole because my prior revenue stream essentially was choked off. So I had to depend a lot more on live things and other outside things, and at this point, at least, if I'm not raking it in, I have the latitude to invent something that may make me and a lot of other people at least give us a more comfortable living, and one that we can depend on for a longer time than you can a record deal.
Now, music video is another area where you're looked on now as an innovator of COT. What do you think of the state of that art today?
Well, there was, one might say, a golden era of music videos, although the video milieu has never been any more golden than music is in general. Music eventually reduces to formulas that most people draw on, and so does video. And there was a time when at least some of the buttons that you could push to get people to respond had yet to be discovered. But nowadays, my feeling is that video has pretty much become enervated. It's very hard to do something original or hard to do something that nobody's seen before. And that makes it a less interesting field to work in. That doesn't mean that I won't be working in it. It just means that I had never originally envisioned myself doing commercials for my own music. But I do envision myself doing other vectors on music, or other vectors on my core ideas that essentially inspire the music. And that's part of the subscription offering that I'm involved in as well. I ask people if they would really like some video, and if they would like some video, then if they're willing to pay for it, I will make it. In the same way that the record company had to underwrite previous video productions. So I still think video is a viable medium, but not necessarily for me as a purely promotional.
Production's another field you've worked heavily in over the years, and you've got a list of credits as long as your arm. What production credit now do you look back on as probably your best work, or one that you're most proud of, anyway? Well,
I've had a couple that have done well. The noteworthy ones, of course, they go back to probably my golden age, when I had multiple singles on the charts by various artists, and that was probably early to mid '70s, when I was doing like Grand Funk Railroad and Badfinger and various artists. I was working with the band, various artists of that ilk. Then I suppose the biggest commercial breakthrough was Meatloaf, of course.
Yep.
And that was just a shot in the dark. I did it because I thought it was an interesting, creative challenge that probably had little commercial potential. And then there have been, various artistically satisfying and, if not triumphant, at least appreciated from a creative standpoint, projects like, for instance, Skylarking by XTC, which was a difficult project to produce, but turned out to be probably their most successful record, and a record that even today artists come to me and say, I'm ready to make my Skylarking. Can you help me? So,
if you were to put it down to one particular thing, what for you is the key to a good production job?
Well, there are any number of elements that, depending on the artist, are more or less important. You don't expect out of some artists meticulous performance, but a high level of songwriting is always, for me, a requisite. Regardless of the style, you have to understand what works in a particular genre. And when someone comes with a lot of strong material, then that always is what piques my interest and makes the job that much easier. As far as what I contribute, I think as time has gone on, it's boiled down to three things. One is my ability to discern what is and isn't a good song, and that's come from having been a writer as well as an appreciator of other people's songs. So I understand the dynamics and mechanisms in it, and I can also recognize when a songwriter is off in the weeds or being lazy or something like that. So it's an attention initially to the material, an attention in terms of the production to certain details that may not be obvious to everybody, but which, to me, sort of subconsciously or viscerally increase people's enjoyment or involvement with a record by some factor, by some appreciable factor. And that may be just making minor suggestions, small suggestions about changes in lyrics or melodies or arrangement or some other thing in the production, but which might not, to the naked eye, appear to make much difference, but which in the end have a subconscious or visceral effect on the way that the music goes down. And then I think finally, I try and get the artist into a performance mode rather than into a transcription mode. Many artists will come into the studio feeling that they've got to lay down something perfect, and that's because most artists nowadays don't write music down on paper. They have no way to capture the so-called perfect essence of what they're trying to do except to actually get in there and commit it to tape. And there's always the temptation to render what they would consider the perfect performance, even though I personally don't believe that such a thing is possible. That if a piece of material is sturdy, and stands the test of time, it's going to be revisited and redone any number of ways, including new variations by the original artists themselves. So I look to get the artist, while they're making the record, into the idea of delivering something unique rather than something perfect. Being able to deliver a performance that's recognizably a moment in time rather than something that, were they good enough, they could reproduce exactly over and over again. And I think that those are the principal elements that go into my productions.
Looking back over your production works, are there any that you look back on now and just wish you hadn't done? They just didn't work for you?
Yeah, but I wouldn't talk about those.
Fair enough. A radio program going over there for a while too, I believe.
Yeah, for almost 2 years I had a radio show.
What was that one all about?
It was a show called The Difference, and the idea was, well, I was approached by a couple of guys who were into, one of which was worked for a syndicated radio company that puts together shows and then syndicates them to a bunch of stations around the country, and another guy who was actually running a show at a non-profit radio station. that was very successful and was actually syndicated to other nonprofit radio stations. They were trying to figure out a way to take that concept and turn it into a commercial profit-making series based around what was then a new radio format called AAA. And that format was supposed to be for people who had grown up or cut their musical teeth in the late 60s and through the 70s and were interested in, let's say, a more musical kind of music rather than a simply stylish kind of music. It revolved very much around a singer-songwriter concept. We had a lot of guests who mostly wrote and performed their own material, and often could do it in a stripped-down context. So the show had a lot of live performances, a lot of interviews, and then the rest of the show was supposed to be about music that, well, at least some significant portion of it fit that concept. Sorry, I have to hold that thought. I have to hop off. There's a Federal Express guy here, and I have a package has to go out.
No worries.
So I'll be in just a second.
That's fine.
Anyway, the musical format, what we played off of records, was to this AAA demographic, more adult-oriented musical genre, and the signature artist of that genre was, I suppose, Hootie and the Blowfish, which was never a favorite of mine, and I refused to ever play them on the show. Never did, but they were that kind of singer-songwriter style of band, and what I did was base the show around that, and then add in all sorts of personal favorites and things that people would probably never hear on the radio.
Right. You pretty much had a free license there to do what you like?
Well, I didn't have a free license because it was syndicated radio, and what happened in the long run was that the format broke down. And radio, commercial radio, is not for the benefit of the listeners. It's for the benefit of the advertisers. If some car company comes in and says, we're looking for a certain demographic, certain income bracket and a certain age, and we're willing to spend, like $50,000 in buys on your station over the next 6 months, if you can attract this demographic. And so they find out what kind of music that particular demographic likes to listen to, and then the radio station's format becomes that. And it doesn't matter how many loyal listeners you had previously to that format. Listeners don't pay you directly. Advertisers pay you directly. So in the long run, the format broke down because the demographic wasn't strong enough to hold the advertisers. And when that started to break down, the syndicatees, the various radio stations who were playing the radio show, started to make demands according to the new format that they had switched to. And this obviously was impossible to satisfy. Each radio station in each market, regardless of regardless of the fact they might have been a AAA station previously, some of them decide, we've got to go a little bit more golden oldies, and another station decides, we've got to go a little bit more adult contemporary, and subsequently they try and pressure you to change the format, and that's when I decided that I was going to get out of that kind of radio.
Yeah. Just cover one or two other things before we go. You recently did or attended some interactive live shows in Japan?
I did it in Japan, I did it in the U.S., and I did it in Europe.
Well, what was the format of that?
Well, when I put No World Order out, it was a kind of an assault on the status quo of music. I made it possible for people in their own homes, given that they had the necessary wherewithal, to completely change the way they experience music. And I had to figure out a way to reproduce that experience live. So I came up with this live interactive show that essentially had me running a bunch of equipment alone on a specially built stage that was set in the middle of the venue, so that I was in the center of the audience rather than behind that sort of that line that you never cross in the normal show, which is the front of the stage. And during the course of the show, people could occupy various levels of the stage. They maybe even could get up onto the top level and affect the way that the show evolved. Sometimes I would get itinerant guitar players up there to show off their skills, and at some points the audience might get so involved in it that I could simply leave the stage and go out and become part of the audience.
All right.
So we took this tour around the world, but it was too much wear and tear on the crew in the long run because of the size of the thing and the fact that we had to take it down and put it up every day and the complexity of it. I am not an artist of U2's stature, so
yeah.
so we didn't really have a massive crew and amount of tech support necessary to continue to go around with this thing.
In terms of audience response, was it successful?
It was successful for me, considering the highly experimental nature of it.
Yeah.
I think audience reactions varied broadly. Some people were into it, thought it was new and really enjoyed the fact that they got an experience they never had before. Other people, it was too new for them. They were too used to going and sitting in the chair the whole time and having the show be the same every night.
Yeah.
So anytime you do something new, it's rare that it succeeds with everyone. But it did carve out a certain territory for me that now I am firmly ensconced in. So whenever anything comes up regarding interactive music, interactive live performance issues, and stuff like that, I'm usually the first person people call when they have some questions or have an idea for something they'd like to try.
Right. Now, I believe you've written your autobiography?
Oh, yeah. Well, an agent approached me a year or so ago, maybe a little longer than that, about the possibility of soliciting a deal for a book. And I didn't think anybody would be interested, but as it turns out, somebody was interested. So made the commitment to actually write my autobiography. Up till now, I'm not finished, but this will cover essentially birth to the first half century of progress, essentially.
Right. How are you finding the experience of writing about your life?
Well, I had to write a good 30 or so pages for anyone to get into the deal in the first place, and I found it kind of fun because I was able to develop a structure that allowed me to forward my other crusades, as well as tell it my way. And that was kind of a conceit for a book that allowed it to be experienced interactively, oddly enough. In other words, a book that you could open to any page and be able to read it and get something out of it. And a book that you could scan in almost any direction. You could read it from the back to the beginning in some ways and get something out of it. You could skip around, or you could read only the bottom paragraph of every page and still have it come out like a book. So that's the challenge, but it doesn't limit the way that I write. It actually makes it easier for me to write.
Yeah. Okay, Todd, look, I won't keep you any longer. I've kept you longer than I said I would, and it sounds like it's getting busy over there.
Yeah, back to work.
Yeah, sure. What's in store for you for the next 12 months?
For the next 12 months, I'm going to be, I'll be going out on the road a little bit. I've got an album, oddly enough, by a global distributor, EMI, on the Guardian label. Is going to be releasing an album that I just did this spring worldwide, which is actually some of my personal standards rendered in a bossa nova style.
Oh, yeah.
And that's called With a Twist, and that's just come out in the States. It'll be out in Australia as well, which would be unusual. And I'll do a little bit of support for that. We'll just kind of see what it does, but the rest of the year is going to be devoted to following up on my online obligations, delivering music directly to my audience, and living in Hawaii while I'm doing it.
Terrific. Okay, well, look, I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'll certainly make sure I'll let everyone know about your website, and hopefully we'll pick up a few Australian subscribers for you there.
Terrific.
Okay.
All righty, thanks
a lot, Todd. Take care.
See you later.
Bye-bye.